are there times where if they're at an affiliate or just like throughout their year where you leverage class?
Oh yeah, definitely.
What are the scenarios?
Potential burnout. If someone's just like tired of grinding.
Yeah, on their own.
Yeah, it's like they need a break. I love leveraging class after like a competitive exhale. So like they hit a competition, we take their downtime. Hey,
like post deload.
100%. It's like, hey, let's do some class.
Like class is not a deload, but it can be like it's
an emotional deload.
Reinvigoration.
100%.
Yeah.
It's not a physical deload.
Yeah. That's a great way to think about like a social, emotional deload. The fitness movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. What's up, man? How's it going?
It's going pretty good.
In the studio for the first time.
The Zor motherland. Lumber Capital Athletics.
Yeah, so today we kind of want to talk about group classes for the competitive CrossFit athlete.
Yep.
And, I think as remote coaches who've worked with the people from, a variety of competitive levels for people who are just completely general fitness, like we've both had personal training clients who are very not good movers, who don't really think about health and fitness the same way that we do, all the way up to people who are trying to be their very best to make a career out of fitness. So, there's quite a spectrum that we work with. And we kind of want to talk through like which of those people is class is appropriate for and which is it not. And how might that change based on the circumstances of your individual gym, because CrossFit is not a franchise and every single one is a little bit different. So it really depends on what you got going on. So we want to start with group classes for non-competitors. So people who care more about just health and fitness.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, I think we can offer a pretty unique, maybe not unique, but a good perspective on this, being that you own a gym, runs group classes. I work for a company who runs a couple different gyms that runs group classes. We both do individualized programming. We've both done personal training. And I feel like a lot of people in the space fall really far on one side or the other.
Yeah.
Or at least the messaging that they put out, I should say.
That's very true. Like a lot of people are either heavily invested in the remote coaching thing where, of course, they're not going to recommend classes.
Correct.
Because their business is not going to thrive if that's what they recommend.
Right.
Or vice versa, where they're like peddling classes because they own a gym and a facility and like they want to do well.
Right.
So,
and for us, it's like...
Yeah, we do sit in the middle.
Yeah. And not only do we sit in the middle, but I feel like we believe really strongly in both, depending on the person. And for us, it's like, whether it's group classes, personal training, individualized remote programming, they're all like a tool in a toolbox. And so it's like finding the right tool for the right person, not just from a movement perspective, but obviously also from like what they want to do.
Yeah, I think some of the most underrated things about classes is like just the environment that you're in.
100%.
Like you're with other people and it's way more easy to be compliant with a program when you're doing it with somebody else. Like
Right.
even if you're not doing an optimal program in the sense that like you're following like a group training program and say it's not even in classes, it's just like a bunch of people doing like the same like blog style workout plan. Like it's actually not a bad option because you're with a bunch of other people also doing the same thing.
Yep.
And there's a lot that just like advantages of having that camaraderie and like doing it alongside other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're going to get into some kind of more specifics, but I've rode the spectrum of this. We've talked about this. Like I've had an individual coach. I had an individual coach for 3 years. Then I programmed for myself for probably about 2 years. And then now it's at the point where between kids and work, it's like, okay, not only do I feel like I don't want to find the time to dedicate towards, trying to train 2 to 3 hours a day. And so it's like, all right, I got an hour. My personal goals are not as surrounding the sport as it was last year, the year before that. And so I take class. And so it's like, I've been able to do all of those. And for me personally now, it's like very similar to what you said, right? Like I could work out on my own and I'd get the job done, and I'm probably more productive than the vast majority of the public working out by themselves, right? But it's way more fun for me to be in class. And for me, it's way more fun to be in class because I don't have these like big athletic goals at this point in my life any longer.
Yeah. And also like for me personally, like there's times where, yeah, like I still have competitive goals. So like, and we're going to get into this, but obviously class isn't always appropriate for people who are trying to compete in the sport.
Right.
But because it probably should be written for people who don't want to compete in the sport. Right. We can debate that. But I would definitely argue about that with anybody. And I would say like there's 100% times where even for the competitive athletes I coach for, as well as myself as a competitive athlete, like that I leverage the class environment to either elicit my best performance or just to like constrain the time I have in a session where like literally, for example, if it's like a 9 a.m. class and I'm like, hey, I'm going to jump into the 9 a.m. class today. It's like, it starts at 9. Like my individualized session, it could start at 9. It could start at 9:10. It could start at 9:50. Like I can start whenever I want.
Right.
So it's kind of nice having a little bit of pressure, just like, hey, this is when it starts. And whether you're there or not, it's going to run.
Right.
So you got to get in the door.
Right.
It's kind of nice.
Yeah. So you had mentioned something about non-competitive athletes.
Yes. So let's go there first. I think this is a really important maybe contrast to the competitive athletes as well. So generally when I say non-competitive, it's like, to me, like I've said this before, but I don't think there really is such a thing as like a GPP like athlete sort of thing. Like, like everyone has a goal.
Right.
Like it's just like their goal might be to be able to play with their grandkids or to go hiking on the weekends or to look good naked, but that's not like general.
Well, yeah, it's like a general fitness program can feed into those goals, but their goals are not to be generally fit.
Yes.
My goal is not to have well-rounded fitness. My goal is to play with my kids, right? And then you as the expert could be like, okay, cool. Like there's a way to have well-rounded, safe fitness to allow you to do that.
Yeah. So let's dive into this. I would say there's a few people in my mind that I think group classes are not for. And it's probably again, we can go into this, but a very experienced competitive athlete who just needs a lot more development of things outside of that. But on the non-competitive side of things, it's people with severe mobility restrictions where class would just be like a liability to them, frankly, or they're in a group environment where the classes are big, where they're going to get thrown into the same scaling option multiple times in a week, where pretty much every time they go there, like, for example, if they got like some really crazy stuff going on with like a limb on the lower body, they're probably going to be like on the ski erg all the time.
Every cardio piece.
Yes. And it's like, do you really want to come in and ski like 4 times a week? The answer might be yes, right? Because they're with other people.
Right.
But oftentimes it's like, if you have someone and they do have a little bit more autonomy and they're okay on their own a little bit more of the time, maybe we take them a different route with the way that you go about it. How do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you were to look at it as a spectrum or like a bell curve, right? The way I kind of think about it is at one end of the bell curve, you might have people who have, for lack of a better term, I'll say severe limitations, right? Yeah. And then on the other half of the bell curve, you have like CrossFit Games athletes, right? And I would say for class, and let's clarify this. This is something we said off air, like, and we're full disclosure, 100% completely biased, right? But when I say class, we're talking like classes at Lumber Capital Athletics, classes at CrossFit Roseland, Sparta Station Athletics for her, CrossFit Steam, our gyms, right? Where it's like well thought out, well programmed, because that's the tough part.
Like asterisk.
Well, I mean, and it's tough to do that because unfortunately, I think CrossFit gets a bad name in the sense that it's like, yes, every gym can do something different because it's not a true franchising. And we just said last night, all you need to open a gym is 3 things: a bank account, a pulse, and a level 1. And it's like
pulse is a very important.
Very important.
Don't try to get it if you're good.
Yeah. So it's like, you could open that stuff and really not know what you're doing and really mess people up, right? But that could happen at like
boot camp,
exactly
YMCA,
right. So
training.
That's not unique to CrossFit in that regard. With all that asterisk in place, right? Assuming class is well programmed, well run, I think.
And that you have a good floor coach.
Of course. I think people at the ends of the bell curve, it's probably not appropriate for.
Yeah.
Now, how far into the bell curve, I think will vary.
Yeah.
Right? Like you touched on it. You might have a gym. Let's use CrossFit Invictus as an example, right? Extremely competitive, well-known name in the space, right? You might have a quote competitors class where it's like, okay, we've inched into this side of the bell curve a little bit more where it's appropriate, right? Or like what we do with the name game, right? Where a lot of the people who get individual program, but on Saturdays we throw down. And the reason why we do that is to get a competitive stimulus, that push, but we don't do it all the time. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have people who are severely limited. And like you said, I've seen this. It's like, we got rowing today and like you can't row, like all right, we'll ski or we'll bike, and it's like you're always on the same piece of equipment.
Or just like dude, you're like 50 years old, you've had 3 shoulder surgeries, right. like yeah, you could come into class on overhead squat day and you could either like try to do it with like a trainer bar that's like completely bent elbows and like it looks like garbage, or you could pick a different variation. But at the end of the day, it's like then you're probably squatting some other time in the week, and now you're getting a lot of contractions on areas of your body that maybe wasn't intended based on the original intent of that programming.
Right.
So it starts to change a lot. If someone's intelligent and they can listen to their body, and they might not move well, but they can be smart about it. And again, they're working with the floor coach who has experience, that could work.
Right. You inch into that side of the bell curve more, right? Like you mentioned, or even we talked about class size, right? If you're a relatively new gym and your classes have 3 to 4 people in every class, it's way easier to be like, hey, I'll just write you something right now, right? Or you have a situation where the person on the floor most often is the person who owns the gym, is also the person who's programming because they're a relatively new gym. And so it's like that person has the full picture of what maybe the next week or 2 look like. And it's like, okay, let's do this. Versus a gym who maybe has been around for 10 years, has 300 members, 20 people per class. It gets infinitely harder to do all that. If you have 20
people in class, you are literally a phys ed teacher in the sense that your job is to, I'm not making this as a dig to phys ed teachers because we were both
phys ed teachers.
But your job is to like manage the space, manage your time, make sure you're on the correct time stamps for the lesson plan, and it's making sure that no one hurts themselves.
Yeah.
That's essentially what your job is.
Listen, like you can get around and cue people and help people, but it's like when the moment class starts, if you have classes that are consistently that big, you're working for that hour, right? Yes. And so again, depending on where you're at, that can inch the bell curve in or push the bell curve out. But I think people at the ends of the spectrum, class is probably not best for them depending on what their goals are.
Yep. So let's go to those 2 ends of the bell curve. For now, let's say that we have someone who's a really poor mover, and what's a scenario where like personal training, like one-on-one with someone who's there who can correct their movement in real time, is actually there, counting the reps, so to speak.
Right.
Like when is that appropriate?
Yeah, I think for me, again, you said poor mover. I mean, we both could probably come up with a bunch of people off the top of our head. We will not name those people, but I've had people, especially people who are elderly, who don't they just don't move well at all. They're locked up. Maybe they haven't, there was I remember very vividly having a gentleman in a sales consultation, and I was like, when was the last time the conversation led to like, when was the last time you worked out? And he was like, I don't know, 1976. And this it's like, okay.
At least you know.
Or there was a gentleman who came in for our challenge the other day who had a cane. I went through the full consultation, was like, afterwards, my coach was like, you sure it's a good idea for that guy? And it's like, you're 100% right. Like, this guy needs personal training.
Yeah. And I think having, again, whoever's doing that consultation to have enough experience to say, obviously we're a business and we're trying to make money, but this isn't appropriate for you.
Yeah. And I mean, in our gyms, we've been like that guy who hasn't worked out since 1976. Like, he took class and got amazing results. and we were able to scale immensely for him, right? But he moved well enough, right? But I've had personal training clients where it's like, we're starting with bodyweight squats to a 24-inch box. Like, it's just like, all right, we're starting from scratch basically. And so for those folks, personal training is probably the best way to go.
So let's go to the other end of the bell curve now. And it's people who are competitive athletes. I mean, most competitive athletes, if you've been around for any length of time, are significantly above that bell curve already.
Yep.
Just from the fact that, like, you're probably younger, you're probably already a little bit more health oriented. Likely you played some sports growing up. Like, the fact that competing is an option, as is like something on your radar, probably already means that you're above majority of the population.
Yeah, and I think some clarification might be a good idea where, at least in my head, and you probably can relate, to me, there's a difference between a competitive athlete and someone who likes to compete. I know for our gyms, we have a lot of people who take class who love doing competitions, right? CrossFit competitions. But they're a mother, father of three. They have a full-time job. Like they're not a competitive CrossFit athlete. They're someone who likes to compete in CrossFit. And to me, those are two totally different things, right? Yeah. Like, we have some people who work for us who are competitive CrossFit athletes. They're training twice a day. In between their sessions, they're doing work for us, obviously, but they're focused on the competitive CrossFit season. They have sponsorships, they're competitive CrossFit athletes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've probably started to separate a little bit more in my mind is, just because someone comes to me and they want coaching and they say they're a competitive CrossFit athlete, the program that I put them on versus like a CrossFit athlete who's like, my life revolves around this.
Yes.
And like, this is like my number one priority in my life. Like, those two programs differ more than someone who likes to compete in class. Like, they're just a competitive person by nature.
Yep.
And the person who says they want to compete. Like, those two programs look more similar
very
than
similar.
The two people who call themselves CrossFit competitors, who have very different lifestyles and very different priorities set in place.
Yeah, so like the second two you mentioned, right? Someone who wants to be a competitor versus someone who wants to take class because they like competing in class and like being competitive. The main difference in there, more often than not, is I think skill work. It's like, okay, like, as far as the pure, like, driving up fitness and strength stuff, that stuff's probably pretty similar. But it's like, this person who wants to be more competitive, it's like, okay, we're going to take some more time on gymnastic skill work because there's still skills you don't have yet, or hammering home positions in certain lifts because you're just a little off there, right? Yeah. Versus the competitive CrossFit athlete who's going to semifinals, finishing top 10 to semifinals, going to the CrossFit Games. It's like, they're training 2-3 times a day. Their progressions are way more advanced. The volume is insanely higher. There's a huge emphasis on, zone 2, aerobic base building work. Strength work can look different, right? So that gap, yes, is much bigger.
Yeah. 100% what you just said is like what a lot of my programs look like. Like, for the people who I'm like, hey, it makes sense for you to leverage the environment of class to get that in-person coaching. And I understand that you want to continue to grow as an athlete and, do competitions sometimes. And like, that's sort of your competitive outlet and you enjoy calling yourself an athlete. You are an athlete.
Yep.
For those people, it's like, hey, let's, get into class on these days. Let's maybe do some focused work before or after that session based on what it is. Often it's skill work, often it's positional work. Often it's just touches of things that they're not getting in class enough. And then maybe we start to sprinkle in some individualized sessions on days where it's makes sense, where either the class workout is something that's really fundamental that maybe you don't need a lot of touches on or whatever. It kind of just based on their schedule. Where do you start for people if they're like, they're doing class a lot, they come to you, they want to start an individualized programming? How often is it like you pull them out of that completely and go like 100% individual design versus like some sort of a hybrid program? And if it is a hybrid program, like how do you work that practically?
Yeah, I think, the classic example is it depends, right? And so if I get someone who is like, I want to get better at CrossFit, I want to be more competitive, and I want to get an individualized program because that's something, I feel like I need to do, right? And we kind of skimmed over it. So before I get into that, with like the CrossFit Games athletes, right? People see those people, and let's face it, guys, they're either programming for themselves and maybe having an outside coach working with them, or they have a team of coaches, which is like, I have a row coach, a running coach, an Olympic lifting coach to work on those specific skills. And then this is like, I think where the sport is and where the sport is going is an athlete has one like centralized, almost like MMA. You have like a centralized coach.
They're in charge of like organizing everything.
Correct.
And making sure that you're not getting pulled too far in one direction.
Correct. And so it's like they'll write the design, but then they'll say, okay, hey, for weightlifting, coach so-and-so is going to come work with you because they're the weightlifting coach.
Yeah.
Right. And for strongman stuff, we're going to work with coach so-and-so because he's a former professional strongman. So he's going to go over the skills with you there.
I think that's a really good example because the sport of MMA is not wrestling.
Correct.
The sport of MMA is not striking.
Yep.
So you have to have someone who can put all those pieces together.
Correct.
And like, you have to be good at putting all those, like if you get hyper focused on wrestling and MMA, you're going to get knocked out.
Right.
Whereas like, it's the same thing. Like if you get too focused on having these perfect positions in your weightlifting, like you're going to forget that you have to do touch and go power cleans in a Metcon.
Right. And someone needs to be there to balance that because, you might be someone who, you go to the wrestling coach for MMA and you do this hard training session. And then it's like, all right, well, I got to go to striking.
Exactly.
And it's like, okay, hey, we got to take it easy with our striking. We're going to work on skill, right? Similar with when we write programs where it's like, all right, hey, someone has a squatting limitation. So we did 10 sets of 2 back squat yesterday, right? Like we're not going to do 150 wall balls the next day, right? So there has to be some intelligent programming there. So that's kind of with the CrossFit Games athletes. So kind of coming back, when I get someone who's not the majority of people, but the majority of people looking to be more competitive, right? They're not already CrossFit Games athletes.
Majority of people that come to us.
Right. So with those folks, most of the people I talk to are like, I want to do this. I want individual attention because I know there's certain things I need to work on. I've been taking class for this long. I've gotten better at the sport. But when you've been doing class for long enough and you have competitive aspirations, you eventually realize I'm not good at these things. And we are not. If I
continue to do this,
right,
I will in 5 years still not be good at these things.
Because naturally in class, you don't touch on those things as often as you need to touch on them to get better at them. And so they come to me and they're like, that's what I want to do.
Sorry, Chris, we're not going to back squat 3 times a week.
Exactly. Right. And so it's like, okay, cool, let's do this. And then often they throw in the caveat, but there's this class on Saturdays. Like I work out with my husband or I work out with my best friend. Like I need to keep that. And my initial reaction generally is, okay, I'll do the best I can.
Yeah.
And the reason why I do that is because we haven't built up trust yet. They're new and I'm new to them. And so it's like, okay, I can't push them too far. Or if they're like, I want to take classes a certain number of times a week, I'll be honest with them. Like if they're like, I want to take class 3-4 times a week still, I'll say, okay, but just so you know, I won't be able to do certain things if we do that. My recommendation, why don't we start with 2 classes a week and then my stuff the other 3 days?
Yeah.
And generally they'll be like, oh, okay. And I'll give them some guidelines, right? Because frankly, that situation is not ideal unless you're coaching someone at Lumber Capital Athletics and you know the program, or I'm coaching someone who works out at one of our 4 gyms and I know the program. But I start there. And then usually what happens is they slowly start to see jumps in progress.
Yeah.
And these people are type A. They're very goal oriented. And then they're like, huh,
this is working.
Yeah. Screw class. I don't want to do that anymore. Right. And so then they're like, I'm getting way better at this, way faster doing this. Or, I had a woman who she was very set on doing Saturday workouts with her husband when we first started.
Yep.
And she quickly realized she was getting so much better with what we were doing the rest of the week. And then factor in that at the time I had my own separate programming company, I started to do at Saturday throwdowns. And she was like,
she would, those.
Yeah. Well, and she would get beat. And it's like, oh, I need to be doing this. If I can't be,
1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Exactly. And so that's kind of usually for me how that transition works.
So at least for me, I'm guessing this is also your experience, is a lot of the people that I work with who are not members here, because I wrote the programming here. So it's so nice to have, this is what the next week is. And I know this is what the next month is going to look like in terms of priorities. And I know this is where the map of the entire year goes. So I have all of the context for that.
Right.
And I know exactly what it's going to be. So it's super easy for me to tailor that to what they need. So the people that go here, it's like an ideal scenario where I can mix and match exactly how I want to do it. And knowing their schedule, we can completely play with that.
Yep.
Most of the time, that's not the case. So if we are in the remote coaching setting where that person's not at your gym and they're like, well, I'd love to keep a touch on class, right? And do it individual sessions 3 times a week and do class twice a week. How often do you have those athletes where it's like, this is what is going to be on those days? Or here, I send these at least a week in advance where you can actually build out my program around these things.
How
often does that happen?
0.
Yeah, that's been my experience.
Never.
It's like, even if that gets said, it never happens.
Never happens.
I am completely blind every single time I've had an athlete in an affiliate other than my own.
Which is tough.
Yeah.
It's super tough.
It's tough might be an understatement. It's you're completely guessing as a coach.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately you have to kind of set that expectation. Like, hey, just to let you know, like we can start this and we'll do what we can. I'm shooting blind here.
Yeah.
And so because of that, I'm going to do.
It's like writing a program without any feedback.
Yeah.
Actually, maybe worse because you're probably going to have interference with what they actually program in class.
Well, that's exactly it. And so you have to be super intelligent about, I say intelligent, but again, you're shooting blind. Intelligent about like, okay, well, what do I put on what days then? And how much do I put on those days? Right? Because it's like
knowing that they're going to get a dose of who knows what.
Right? Like I can't give them 100 chest to bars in a workout. And then it's like the next day they have chest to bars. And it's like, oh, you're doing 100 again. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And oftentimes that athlete will do them.
100%.
They'll just do it.
Yep.
Like, you didn't want to modify that at all.
Right. But again, it has to be the conversation because in those examples, and I try very, very hard to set expectations because we've been doing this long enough where people, unfortunately, and not people necessarily we've worked with, but I've heard stories where it's like, oh, my friggin' coach, blah, 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 blah. Or, and it's like, that exists, right? In every profession, there are people who are not good at what they do, but it's like, you're setting your coach up for failure, potential failure, higher increased rate of failure, because they don't know what those other days look like, right? And so setting the expectation of like, hey, this is what we're going to do. Because of that, there's a chance this scenario could arise. If that arises, do not.
This is your job.
Right.
Is to not do the same thing.
Right.
In an irresponsible volume back to
right. And then if that were to happen, as a coach, you've set yourself up, not to say I told you so, but kind of say I told you so. Not to say I told you so to stick it to the client, but kind of be like, hey, all right, we're here. We're going to rehab this issue.
Yeah.
We talked about this though, and this is why we talked about it.
Yeah, often you can't tell them. You have to like let them see it first.
Yeah.
And that's the way it is with a lot of things. Like I can't tell somebody that they have to do muscle up development 3 times a week, but when they don't go to quarterfinals because they didn't have it for the open, it's like, do you want to go to quarterfinals? And
right.
That becomes a really easy conversation for that.
Right.
It's the same sort of thing. Like, hey, I told you this was going to be the case. Like, here it is right in front of you.
Yeah. And you don't have to make it I told you so conversation. It could be
no,
like,
I don't think it is that way.
It's more like, hey, last time we talked, you said these were your goals. We're working to get towards though, but this is kind of working against what we talked about. Right. And so if your goals have changed or your priorities have changed, that's totally fine. Just let me know. We'll change things up. But if they haven't changed, then we need to make some adjustments. And this is why. Is that something you're willing to do?
Mm-hmm. So let's say we got a more experienced CrossFit athlete. Are there times where for those people who are, let's say they're very rarely in classes. So you're writing mostly individualized sessions for them. Are there times where if they're at an affiliate or just like throughout their year where you leverage class?
Oh yeah, definitely.
What are the scenarios?
I mean, I had an athlete who was, potential burnout. You know, if someone's just like tired of grinding.
Yeah, on their own.
Yeah, it's like they need a break. I love leveraging class after like a competitive exhale. So like they hit a competition, we take their downtime. Hey,
like post deload.
100%. It's like, hey, let's do some class.
Like class is not a deload, but it can be like it's
an emotional deload.
Reinvigoration.
100%.
Yeah.
It's not a physical deload.
Yeah. That's a great way to think about like a social, emotional deload.
Right. Because a lot of times, I mean, in a remote setting, a lot of these athletes are working out by themselves. Now you have the occasional athlete, like I know one, like we talked to Blair a while back. She has a woman, Raina, who they link up and she does all her workouts. Now they scale for her, right? But for Blair, that's awesome to just have another person there.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily the scenario for a lot of people. For me, who works at a gym, right? When I was doing my own programming, it was great. Me and the staff worked out at 1:00. And so I always had people there. But if you're always working out by yourself, like I have an athlete who works out early, like 5 in the morning.
Especially if you're like, it's even helpful to have someone else there in the facility when you're doing your session, even if they're not doing the same thing as you.
Yeah. We're social animals.
Yeah. Like if I'm doing, muscle ups and snatches on Monday and you're doing back squats, and you're in the rack next to me, I am actually more motivated to keep doing what I'm doing than if you weren't there at all.
Right. And so that's kind of what I like to do is like, all right, hey, let's just take an exhale. All right. We've let your body recover. Your brain's recovered a little bit. Get into class, have a good time. Don't think about training. Cause that's the other thing is like when have competitive aspirations, you have to be very intentional about what you're doing. If you want to actually get the results, you have to be thoughtful about your workout, thoughtful about maybe adjusting based on how you feel. Like there's a lot of brain power that goes into that. And so to kind of like throw that to the wayside and say, hey, someone's going to do all this thinking for me and I'm just going in there and I don't care what's on the bar.
Yeah, the reason why people do classes in the first place.
Exactly. And so I leverage that with my athletes all the time. Post the season, it's like, hey, go take class for 2 weeks and then we'll reconvene.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I do that a lot. I think other times that I have here that I think about is travel.
Yep.
So someone's not going on vacation. Stacy will go to Florida sometimes. I'm like, hey, here's 3 floater sessions that you could do that are individual designed based on your priorities and work these around what they got going on in class. But class is like your goal to to get that in every day.
Yep.
And like if you get to this other, goodies, great, but that doesn't matter nearly as much as like, hey, go in there and again, oftentimes the reason I do that too is because the gym situation is often completely unknown.
Right.
We don't know if they have open gym. Like Sam Hagen just went to Turkey.
Okay.
And it was like,
he's like,
man, we have no idea what the gym situation is going to be. So it's like, hey, like here's some floater sessions, get these in if you can. And then it's like, yeah.
Just do what you can.
Do what you can. Literally.
Right.
So,
and you can do, for again, just to speak on someone with competitive aspirations or a competitive athlete, like these are situations where it's like, okay, we have things going on. Let's just maintain fitness during this week. And then because, we've all been there. You take a week off, you travel or whatever, and then you come back and that first session just feels like garbage, no matter, you know what I mean? No matter what.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, well, let's just maintain fitness. Let's maintain some workouts, even if it's like 3 times that week. And then you come back and you don't feel bad during your first session and can kind of pick up where you left off. There's nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah. And then I would say the other times that I might do that, again, this is more for like my athletes here because most of the time I don't know the perimeter of the gym.
Right.
And I'm not going to go out of my way to try to find it every single week. Like that's just unreasonable, to be honest. But for example, if I know that we're going to test the CrossFit total and we've been going through the strength progression for them and it fits and it makes sense.
Yeah. Why not
leverage class?
Yep.
Right. Like the environment's going to be incredible. There's going to be a bunch of people there
cheering each other on.
Out.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, why not, like if it's the time to get amped up and like crush it, Like, why not leverage class? Why not leverage class for Friday Night Lights for the Open? Why not leverage your community of people for a quarterfinals test or something?
Right.
So those are the other times that I think it's like, it's like, if class makes sense and it lines up, use it.
Right. And then, I mean, just to go back to the topic at hand, and then in the beginning, we mentioned the bell curve. For us, everyone else in the middle, classes couldn't be more appropriate for. And again, it's, people, there's going to be some adjustments to that. Like, you might have someone who is like a real super duper fit former games athlete that just doesn't want to do it anymore. That's not their goal.
Yeah.
They fall in the middle of that bell curve.
Yeah.
Fitness wise, they fall on the end.
Yeah.
But because of their goals, it's like, just go take class, and I think class, again, well-structured, well-programmed, good floor coach is appropriate for the vast majority of people.
Agreed. Let's leave it there.
Cool, man.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just found the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while and enjoying what you're hearing, I would encourage you to leave a rating or review for the show. It would definitely help us out. And lastly, if you're someone who does take your fitness seriously and cares about your performance deeply, I would encourage you to look into hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.